detectives. And finally, to describe the decline of traditional Buddhist historiography with the emergence of modern Buddhist historians. So I want to begin with the case for Buddhist historiography. The existence of such a category is the premise and the main argument of my book. I teach a course called Buddhist Historiography that looks at Buddhist historians from India, Sri Lanka, Tibet, China, and Japan. But is there a Buddhist way to understand the past? And is the past even important in Buddhism? In 1951, Edward Kanza weighed in on the problem of Buddhist historiography when he wrote, "The Dharma itself has no history. Historical change is considered as quite unimportant compared with the unchanging truth." Now, I'm tempted to stop my talk right here and to open the floor for discussion. I think there's enough knowledge about Buddhism in this room to spend the next hour reflecting on these two lines alone. So Kanza isn't the perfect straw man for my attempt to champion the study of Buddhist historiography. Even if we reduce Kanza to just this quotation, "The Dharma itself has no history. Historical change is considered as quite unimportant compared with the unchanging truth." So he's not saying that Buddhism has no history. He is saying that traditionally, Buddhists did not believe the Dharma had a history. So Kanza was looking for some unchanging essence that's in the title of his book. But then he immediately contradicts it with the last word of his title, development. So he seems to want to reject historical consciousness in Buddhism, even if it is his job in part to trace Buddhist history. In the same way that if you see inscriptions on Buddhist images, they begin by rejecting the value of Buddhist images. Or in Chan writers who begin their works by questioning the value of the written word. So Kanza's point here isn't that Buddhists of the distant past did not recognize historical change. His point is that historical change just didn't matter to them. But again, I imagine that people in this room are familiar with we're familiar with Buddhist notions of cyclical time, and also the discourse on the decline of the Dharma would quickly question one part of his quotation when he says the Dharma itself has no history. In fact, the Dharma in Buddhist thought clearly does have a history, perhaps not in its essence, but certainly in the way that the Dharma appears in the world. The Dharma is linked to a Buddha, it is discovered, it flourishes, and then it declines. In other words, the Dharma changes over time, which is one definition of what makes history history. So in my imagined discussion of this quotation, after hearing someone in the audience raise this objection to Kanza, I can imagine someone else coming to his defense to say we're still missing his main point, the main point of his argument. So his point is that Buddhism has a history. Buddhists are aware of that history, but that history repeats itself. History is cyclical. So here I'm following Jan Nattier, where she shows that we can visualize time in Buddhism as a parabola. But we could also view it as cyclical, as a circle. So this pattern repeats within a cycle of kalpas. Buddhas come and Buddhas go, but time continues up and down, up and down. Now, if time is just an endless succession of these parabolas up and down, or circles round and around, then does history matter? Because it seems that history is going nowhere. L.S. Pereira, in the quotation I'm about to read, is writing on an obvious source for Buddhist historiography, which is Ceylonese chronicles, the famous Mahavamsa, the chronicles from Sri Lanka. Pereira begins by outlining that cyclical view of history in Buddhist thought. Buddhas, the Dharma, the world we live in are all born, flourish, then decay and die, only to be reborn again. The consequences of this view of time, time as cyclical, is to reduce the significance of the past. So Pereira writes, this cyclical conception of history is but a reflection of their background philosophy, that is, the philosophy of Buddhists, which places the ultimate reality and the goal of life outside the succession of births and rebirths, or what would today be called the process of history. History itself was of little significance, therefore, except as a means to an end. History itself was of little significance, therefore, except as a means to an end. If the major events of time simply repeat in a cycle, then once you have charted that cycle, there is little left to do. So once we've seen that toy train of history go around the tracks once, how long can it hold our interest, circling around and around to no discernible purpose? Now, cyclical time, in its relation to historiography, isn't just a problem for scholars of Buddhism. Discussion of the problem of cyclical time is common in research on early Western historiography, particularly in a religious context. So the scholar C.A. Petridis was not the first or the last to comment on cyclical time in the West, but he does have the best book title on the topic, The Phoenix and the Ladder. This is his grand book on ancient Western historiography. So the phoenix is that bird that dies in flames only to be reborn again. So for Petridis, the phoenix represents the cyclical view of time of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Petridis's book traces the shift from this view of cyclical time of the Greeks and the Romans to the finite view of time of Jews and Christians. That's the latter in his title. So history came to have meaning for Jews and for Christians because it was going somewhere, up like a ladder, taking us rung by rung to a more elevated plane, a final destination. In contrast, in the cyclical view of history, however dramatic the rise of the phoenix from the flames, the cyclical nature of time robbed any given event or moment of individuality and hence significance. For the Greeks and the Romans, in the grand scheme of things, history was, for educated people, boring. Ultimately, the details of the past just didn't matter. But more or less at the time that Petridis was writing his book, The Phoenix and the Ladder, no less than one of the greatest historians of historiography, Arnaldo Momigliano, pointed out reasonably that notions of time were not uniform in the ancient world. In particular, the views expressed on cyclical time by Greek philosophers were not shared by Greek historians. Different people had different ideas about time. So Momigliani wrote, if one wants to understand something about Greek historians, and the real differences between them and biblical historians, Jews and Christians, the first precaution is to beware of the cyclical notion of time. Similarly, while it might be productive to explore the implications of Sarvastivadin analysis of time for history, philosophical positions often fall by the wayside when a historian starts to narrate the past. And historiography takes many forms, finding expression in various genres that intersect with philosophical writings, or sometimes have very little to do with philosophical writings. So if we set aside the philosophical discussions of the nature of time, and we stop equating history with sober, dispassionate chronicles, and if we look simply for writings in Buddhism about the past, then we see history everywhere in Buddhist writings of all kinds. Moreover, in the passage that I opened with by Edward Kanza, and 10 years later when Kanza wrote this, to the modern historian, Buddhism is a phenomenon which must exasperate him at every point. And we can only say in extenuation that this religion was not founded for the benefit of historians. When he said this, he wasn't really commenting on Buddhism in general. He was talking about Buddhism in India. So this religion was not founded for the benefit of historians. I don't know what religion was founded for the benefit of historians. I wish there were such a religion. But if this is true to some extent for Indian Buddhism, it does work for India to some extent, right? With rare exceptions, we don't have the sorts of texts we are accustomed to calling history when we look at Indian writings. We don't have chronicles, we don't have collections of biographies and so on. And this absence of easily recognizable historical genres and vocabulary in Indian Buddhism is precisely the reason that the big methodological breakthroughs in Buddhist historiography are most likely to come from scholars working on South Asian Buddhism, on Indian Buddhism, because they're forced to look for history in unlikely places, to look for views of the past in sutras, the historiography of the monastic regulations. Do you see views of the past in the Vinaya and so on? Or history in ritual, historiography in material culture. This is what scholars working on Indian Buddhism would have to do. In contrast, for those of us who work on Tibet or on East Asia, we don't have to be especially sophisticated to find Buddhist historiography. Buddhist historians in China, Tibet, Korea, and Japan were not especially concerned with cyclical time. You know, they might, at some level of abstraction, all accept it, but they were interested in the sorts of historical problems that concern all historians. Chronological accuracy. You know, East Asian Buddhists were concerned about getting their dates right. They were interested in influence and causation. They were interested in what do you do when you have two historical sources that contradict each other, and so on. So in Tibet and in East Asia, it's not hard to find evidence for historical consciousness. Specifically, the idea that Buddhist writers weren't just telling stories that were supposed to convey moral lessons. Buddhist historians in East Asia were attempting to accurately reconstruct the past. So pre-modern Buddhist historians drawn to history often interrupt perfectly good stories to tell us that a particular date is disputed, or that another source gives a different place name. Often in cases when the date or the alternative source don't really add anything to the lesson of the story, or even to the entertainment value of the story. Historians in East Asia, in truth, aren't necessarily particularly good storytellers because they're so concerned with getting their facts straight. This is one feature that distinguishes elite traditional historiography from popular Buddhist literature. So the historians had no problem drifting off topic to discuss sources, dates, the etymology of people and place names, and all sorts of other, tiny problems. And we can find parallels for tables of contents, for bibliographies, and even footnotes in pre-modern Buddhist historiography. It's all very familiar for modern historians. In fact, for much of Buddhist historiography outside of India, the real challenge isn't in identifying historiography. The real challenge is in identifying what's Buddhist about it. On one level, this is easy in that the vast majority of historiography written by self-professed Buddhists, mostly monks, treats the history of Buddhism, the history of Buddhist texts, the history of Buddhist monastics, the history of Buddhist institutions. There are rare exceptions, but in general, Buddhist monks who were interested in history wrote histories of Buddhism, including both grand histories stretching back to the Buddha and before, and also more modest works for a particular time or a particular region. Now, part of what I tried to do in my book, and I'm not sure how successfully, was to identify what was Buddhist about the approach to the past in histories written by Buddhists in China. I tried to make the case for a range of practices and different goals. So Buddhist historians sometimes would use the miraculous to describe conflicting sources. They constructed genealogies of masters and disciples as a way of organizing the history of monks. They had an unusual fascination with India's past, which you don't see in non-Buddhist historians. And they used prophecy in creative ways to reconstruct the past. But if I had to choose one episode illustrating what makes Buddhist historiography distinctive, it would be a series of comments by the 7th century historian Dao Xuan. In one of his historiographical essays, Dao Xuan returned to a famous passage in the Shiji, in the records of the historian, by the father of Chinese history, Sima Qian. It's a part of Sima Qian's book that tells the story of two virtuous men who, because of their integrity, were forced into exile and in the end died miserable deaths. They starved in the wilderness. So Sima Qian tells the story of these two men, Shu Qi and Bo Yi, who were great men, but suffered horribly in their lives. And he found that story very troubling, Sima Qian did. He combed through history, and he found many examples in the historical record of good people who suffered horribly in their lives. And also he found many examples of bad people who lived long and happy lives. And Sima Qian found this very troubling and has this famous passage where he says, why is it that good people so often suffer and the bad people so often prosper? Where is heaven in all of this? Why is destiny so often so cruel? Now, hundreds of years after Sima Qian's Shiji, the Buddhist monk Dao Xuan, now with knowledge of karma, knowledge of rebirth, came back to this story and explained that historiography had advanced since Sima Qian's day. So Sima Qian's despair at the injustice of the past was because he was ignorant of how destiny works. Dao Xuan wrote, that which the Confucians call destiny, we Buddhists call karma. Destiny is tied to karma, and karma is tied to the mind. As the products of the mind are uneven, the results of karma vary. He then goes on to explain the importance of taking account when reading history of the full time frame over which karmic retribution takes place. Good people may suffer in payment for immoral acts they committed in a previous life, but one day, in a future life, they will be rewarded for their virtue. And those who lived horrible lives of cruelty and selfishness may seem to prosper. They may prosper in this lifetime, but eventually, in a future lifetime, they will suffer for their cruelty and for their selfishness. Finally, Daoshen says, now that historians understand these basic Buddhist principles, history makes moral sense. Beyond solving a moral problem presented by the historical record, karma provided a new way to read the past. Since karma is fundamentally a historical doctrine, it's a natural law that can only be observed over time. And often you can only see the workings of karma over vast stretches of time. Now, Buddhist historians believed that through careful analysis and wide reading, it was possible to detect the traces of karma at work. And finding these karmic traces, linking cause to result, wasn't easy. It required vast knowledge, erudition, it required mastery of the historical record, and it required a keen eye for detail. So in service to this project, Buddhist historians, for example, looked through the historical record for stories of children who remembered their previous lives better than the rest of us. They also collected stories of people who died temporarily and then returned to life and gave us accounts of karmic punishments meted out to historical figures. And my favorite are they often speculate on stories of famous figures who were reincarnations of other famous figures and carefully compare dates to make sure these rebirths were possible. Now, the bulk of my book was an attempt as best as I could to isolate the tools that these Buddhist historians in China used, these karmic detectives. These included more than just the application of the doctrine of karma to understanding history. But for today, I'm using the term karmic detective to represent everything that made the pre-modern Buddhist historians' work not just history, but Buddhist history. The last chapter of the book, which I want to spend some time on here today, turned to the modern period, when just about everything that I wrote for most of the book faded in the space of a few decades and was replaced by modern academic historiography. Now, 20th century Chinese historiography is fascinating, I think, for many reasons. It continues to surprise me that in the midst of war, economic collapse, reform, and revolution, some monks turned to the writing of history for comfort and for meaning. Moreover, as we'll see in a moment, some Buddhist historians developed new ideas about what it might mean to be a Buddhist historian in the modern world. For me, in the context of my project, what first attracted me to modern Buddhist historians was what is missing. So just as Indian Buddhist historiography is especially intriguing for what's missing, where are the dates in India? Where are the chronicles? Where are the collections of biographies? In the same way, modern Chinese Buddhist historiography is revealing for what is missing, for the parts of the tradition that it left out. Now, to understand this push away from tradition and the pull towards something new, we have to consider the extent to which Chinese Buddhist historiography was responding to court historiography. So I chose this image for the cover of my book in an attempt to illustrate that more often than not, Buddhist historians were writing under that judgmental gaze of literati, and especially court historians. It was the court historians writing their dynastic histories who set the agenda, who established the formats and laid out the ways to distinguish the elite scholar from the hack. In some cases, court historians and other literati read Buddhist histories, but even when they didn't, even when Buddhist historians seem to have been writing for other Buddhists, aware that their work was destined for monastic libraries rather than imperial ones, you sense that they still hoped to draw in and impress the more prestigious historians writing their grand dynastic histories. So we just saw an example of this with Dao Xuan, showing how because he understood karma, he could see the past more clearly than even Sima Qian, than even the father of all of Buddhist history. Now, if we move to the 20th century, the object of this largely one-way conversation suddenly was transformed. In the early years of the Republic, the early years of the 20th century, Chinese historiography went through a radical transformation, led by men like these. And now they weren't writing at court, they were writing in the newly founded universities. So someone like Gu Jiegang promoted the movement of doubting antiquity. He challenged received tradition at every turn. And he also was among the first to champion the study of folklore and not just elite records of emperors and generals. Now, for the study of Buddhist history in particular, figures like Chen Yuan on the right and Hu Shi on the left are more important than their monastic contemporaries if our goal is to understand the Buddhist past rather than modern Buddhist attitudes towards the past. So Chen Yuan is probably my favorite there on the right. I think his work still really holds up very well so many years later, and Hu Shi to some extent too. I mean, these were great historians. So if I were constructing my pantheon of the great historians of Buddhism that emerged in China in the early 20th century, I would add a few more, including Liang Qichao, who's not in the picture, but he wrote the first history of Chinese Buddhism in Chinese. And of course, maybe the greatest of them all would be Tang Yongtong, who's also not in the picture. But his history of Buddhism in the Six Dynasties is still a model of elegance, precision, insight, a truly great book. And just to round out these giants of modern Chinese historiography, we should probably include Chen Yinke, who's probably the most revered historian of his generation today. When modern Chinese intellectuals talk about Chen Yinke, their eyes kind of glow, right? They're so enthusiastic about him. And I would also add Fu Xinyan, who unfortunately didn't write on Buddhism, but was a major figure in developing historiography in modern China. Now, if you can see this far from where you're sitting, notice how close their dates are, the dates of birth. So this was a generation of talented scholars that I think has no equal before or since. They aren't all in this picture, all these figures I mentioned, but they might as well have been because their relations were so close. Gu Jiegang and Fu Xinyan were college roommates. Hu Shi was the president of Academia Sinica when Fu Xinyan was the head of the Institute of History and Philology. So these men, they all studied at the same universities. They published in the same journals. They all knew each other. They came from the same social background. They all were sons of stern, erudite fathers who trained them in the tradition. And they all studied abroad. Hu Shi studied at Columbia, New York. Tang Yongtong was at Harvard. Fu Xinyan at Berlin University. And when they returned from abroad, excited about the latest historiographical theories and methods, they attacked their own tradition. They attacked Chinese history. They questioned everything. They absorbed new sources that previous historians had ignored, or they read old sources in radical new, unconventional ways. And some of them applied this erudition and energy to the history of Buddhism. There's a recent PhD dissertation done in Germany by a young scholar called Peng Qinqin on Buddhist historiography in modern China that focuses on this group. But I didn't, because none of them were Buddhists. So they might pride themselves on their knowledge of Buddhism, but their commitment to Buddhism as a religion was, at best, ambivalent. Liang Qichao, he once said that ideally China should have no religion, but if it needed one, perhaps Buddhism with some changes would be the best possible option. Chen Yuan kept insisting throughout his life that he was a scholar of religion and not a proponent of any particular religion. So he also wrote important works on Chinese Islam and Chinese Christianity. Even Tang Yongtong was born in Huangmei, which is where the county where Chan Buddhism was born. But you read Tang Yongtong's books, nowhere does he suggest he might be sympathetic to Buddhism or himself a Buddhist. And Hu Shi was the opposite. Hu Shi expressed open contempt for Buddhism and complained about the influence of Buddhism in China and the influence of India on China. So if we're looking for a Buddhist historian, if we're looking for what I call the karmic detective, we have to look instead to monks and to laymen. So I talk about a number of different figures in my book, but today I just want to focus on two. Taishu and his most prominent disciple, Yin Shun. And if you look at their dates, their lives put together pretty much take up the 20th century. Now, they're most often mentioned as Buddhist modernists, especially as Buddhists who promoted engaged Buddhism or what's called humanistic Buddhism, 人间佛教. That said, a number of scholars, including Ho Kun Hong, Justin Ritzinger, and Marcus Bingenheimer, have shown that their writings covered much more, including historiography. Now, I want to try to show today that the karmic detective, that is the traditional Buddhist historian, disappeared somewhere between these two. First, a little bit of background. Both because of their position as monastics and because of their the humble social status of their families, monks like Taishu and Yin Shun did not have access to the cosmopolitan world of academic historians that I showed in the previous slide. They didn't have those erudite, sophisticated fathers who insisted on a classical education. They didn't have families who funded them to take trips abroad. Neither of them ever had the opportunity to study foreign languages or attend universities in Japan or in the West. They published in small Buddhist journals for a small Buddhist audience, and they were never invited to lecture at the famous new Buddhist universities. Taishu was the orphaned son of a small-town construction worker. He was raised on the edge of poverty, and he received a very erratic education as a child. And he's not really known as a historian. He's known as a reformer, but he did write some historical works, and he picked up his sources and his methods kind of as best he could. So he was self-taught. So in order to show the gap between a monk like Taishu and the academic historians, consider Taishu's relationship to the great Fu Xinyan. So Fu Xinyan had come back to China from Germany, and he was shaking up the whole academic world with his new insights from studying there, where he studied Ranke, he studied other critical historians in Berlin. But Taishu had to settle for a Chinese translation of a popular English work. So Taishu read H.G. Wells' Brief History of the World and wrote a review of it. He was very excited about this book that he read in Chinese translation. He was especially excited by the way H.G. Wells described Chinese history and its place in the history of the world. But ironically, when H.G. Wells was writing the section on China for his History of the World, he consulted with Fu Xinyan, who was visiting London from Germany at the time. So rather than reading Fu Xinyan's works in Chinese, or just visiting Fu Xinyan in China in his office, Taishu's only way of accessing Fu Xinyan's ideas was through a translated work by an English author. And I mention this because I think this episode illustrates the dynamics of the time. Chinese Buddhist monks who wrote history, they lived apart from the professors. They argued among themselves. They published in their own journals. At the same time, that anecdote of Taishu learning about Fu Xinyan by reading H.G. Wells shows that still some of the ideas of these new historians got through to them. The gap between the historiographical trends among the new generation of academic historians teaching and writing in universities and monks writing their Buddhist histories in their monasteries was not just the product of their different backgrounds or their access to different resources. The differences ran deeper. The constraints of their Buddhist faith did not allow these monastic historians the freedom to do the same kinds of scholarship that some of those academic professors were doing. So Gu Jiegang was proving his worth by showing that the classics were forgeries. He wanted to show Chinese classics were forgeries, but monks had no interest in demonstrating that, classical Buddhist sutras were forgeries, or they had no interest in challenging biographies of famous Buddhist figures. The stakes were just too high to challenge the existence of the Buddha, as Gu had done with the Yellow Emperor, or to even probe the oldest strata of Buddhist history with the sort of rigor that Gu Jiegang applied to ancient Chinese culture. Chinese monks were not drawn to challenge the authenticity of foundational scriptures the way that modern historians were eager to shock their fathers by challenging the authenticity of Chinese classics. For historians writing as Buddhists, old problems that had occupied the karmic detectives that I talk about in my book, like refuting the story that Lao Tzu created Buddhism. This was a major problem in traditional Buddhist historiography. It was Buddhists demonstrating that Lao Tzu could not have created Buddhism, or dating the periods of the decline of the Dharma. These problems kind of faded into the background. Instead, they were concerned about a new array of challenges that was being created by the academic historians. To give a sense of the new challenge these monks faced, I want to focus on just two problems. One is the world history of Buddhism. How do you write the world history of Buddhism? And the second is the problem with Bodhidharma. Perhaps it was with H.G. Wells in mind that Taishu composed his own brief history of Buddhism, beginning by noting that even though there were millions of Buddhists in the world, he said, there is as yet no complete history that records events marking the rise and decline, the ebb and flow of Buddhism. that conveys the spirit of its import. Is this not a great pity? So previously, there had been grand Buddhist histories of the history of Buddhism, some of them stretching back to India. But before the 20th century, these were essentially histories of Chinese Buddhism, with Indian Buddhism as background. What Taishu wanted to do was different. He wanted a history of the whole Buddhist world that would include Tibet, Ceylon, China, Korea, Japan. And to do this, he proposed his own history of Buddhism by dividing it into 5 different periods. So first, he was going to write about the era of creation, followed by the era of dissemination. Then he would write on the Asian era, and finally, the current period, the global era. But despite this radical new time frame for understanding Buddhist history, its contents, once you read what he actually wrote, are extremely conventional. They sound very much like pre-modern Buddhist history. Taishu begins by dating the Buddha, and he dates the Buddha to 3,000 years ago, a date that source critical approach to the question was already finding unbelievable. In his account of the Buddha in that era of creation, Taishu states that the first scripture the Buddha preached was the Avatamsaka Sutra. This, again, is an idea that he derived from traditional Chinese Buddhist historiography, from the Panjiao, or classification of scriptures, that serious modern Buddhist historians were ready to abandon. And when Taishu talked about the introduction of Buddhism to China, he began with the legend of the Emperor Ming of the Han having a dream, the Han Mingdi having his dream, that soon those scholars I showed you in the photograph were all going to debunk as, unreliable. So despite his interest in a big new global history of Buddhism, Taishu didn't really take on the challenges, either of unifying different traditions or of adopting the new historiography. This problem for modern Buddhist historiography is even clearer in the second case I wanted to focus on, which is the treatment of the Bodhidharma problem. Bodhidharma's biography is famously complicated by layers. There's layer and layer of legends that are added over the centuries. And excellent Chan scholars over the past 50, 60 years have done an excellent job of showing how Bodhidharma's legend grew. Initially, Taishu's writing on Chan history showed little awareness of the challenge that was coming with academic historians. He accepted a traditional account. When he wrote about Bodhidharma, Taishu said Bodhidharma came from southern India during the Liang dynasty. He met the emperor, he met Liang Wudi. He went to Shaolin Monastery where he meditated for 9 years. He just told the conventional story. But in contrast, in 1927, Hu Shi, that I showed in the picture earlier, published an article on Bodhidharma. So Hu Shi condemned the traditional history of Bodhidharma as unreliable and almost entirely fabricated. And Hu Shi always wrote in this very sarcastic tone. That was one of his characteristics as well. So he wrote, "The legend of Bodhidharma is an extremely important koan in the history of the Chan school. The Chan school, revering Bodhidharma as its first patriarch, manufactured many absurd myths, raising doubts in the minds of later scholars." If we examine the historical evidence, we must admit that he was a historical personage, but his actions were far less important than those of the legend. In other words, the entire Chan genealogy, which claimed that the Dharma had been transmitted from the Buddha to China in a single line of transmission, was based on a lie. Others in the tradition had centuries earlier noted problems in the biography of Bodhidharma. So maybe Husser's greatest innovation is at the end, when he says that his actions were far less important than those of the legend. The legend is more important than the facts, right? So this is now standard in the study of Bodhidharma, and not just for Bodhidharma, but for the study of hagiography, biographies of saints in general, that what matters historically is the legend, not whatever kernel of truth might lie at its origins. But when Taishu read Husser's account, he saw it as an attack on Buddhism. And in his own attempt to save the Chan lineage, he turned to traditional Buddhist historiography. So Taishu wrote a response to Husser, which Husser probably never read, where he explained that the problems in the accounts of Bodhidharma were probably mistakes in transcription. You know, the confusing two figures with similar names. And this is a technique that pre-modern Buddhist historians used all the time, of seeing scribal errors. Right? Or he said it was, perhaps the problem was that the story of Bodhidharma was transmitted orally outside the written teachings. So that's why sometimes it's much later that you have an account that appears, a new account appears, because that hadn't been put on paper until much later. And finally, he says that Bodhidharma was a holy man who lived an incredibly long life, you know, well over 100 years. So of course, his life story can't be compared to ordinary men. In other words, Taishu's historiographical techniques were very traditional. They were in keeping with the techniques that Buddhist historians had been using for centuries by explaining problems with scribal errors, with oral transmission, with the miraculous. So if we define, as I said, the karmic detective as not just using karma to interpret history, but as representing all of those concerns associated with traditional Buddhist historiography in pre-modern China, then Taishu was perhaps the last karmic detective. He still accepted traditional ideas like karma as a historical force, and he used prophecy and miracles to explain the past. But we can begin to see the transformation to a different type of history in Taishu's later writing. But the change is clearest, really, in the writings of his greatest disciple, Yin Shun. As part of his project to unite all Buddhists in the global history of Buddhism, Taishu wanted his disciple to sort out the problem of the Buddha's dates so that everyone could agree on the Buddha's dates. And this had been a major problem in Chinese Buddhist historiography for a long time. By the 20th century, most Chinese Buddhists accepted the date for the Buddha of 949 BC. And that's why, but others in other Buddhist traditions in the world, especially in Sri Lanka, had followed a different tradition. And that's why Taishu wanted a single convincing date. So he sent his student off to do it. And in 1950, Yin Shun published the results of his research. And notice that date. He wrote this in 1950 in the midst of what must have been incredibly stressful, even terrifying circumstances as he fled mainland China for Hong Kong before eventually relocating to Taiwan. In the end, through careful analysis, he settled on the date 390 BCE. That's roughly what modern scholars now call the short chronology. He did this independently. Just as interesting as the new date were the techniques he used to arrive at the new date. So this is what's missing from Yin Shun, what marks him as different. He had no discussion of stars. So traditionally, by dating the Buddha, it's by what did the sky look like at the time of the Buddha's death? Were there records of this in Chinese historical sources? He used no Chinese apocryphal texts. So often there are texts that claim that they noted the date of the Buddha's birth, when it happened, right? But these texts are not reliable. Right? He made no mention of prophecy, and most radical of all, he was even willing to challenge the authenticity of texts composed in India, something pre-modern historians, Buddhist historians in China never did. Once a text could be shown to have come from India, it was authentic. Now, it's very hard to place Yinshun in modern historiography of Indian Buddhism because he didn't read works he didn't read scholarship, basically. He never learned any Indic languages. He based his research entirely on his own independent reading of the Chinese canon. But at the same time, surprisingly, his approach is entirely in keeping with what modern academic scholars were doing in Japan, America, and Europe. His approach to the Bodhidharma problem tells a similar story. So unlike Taishu, who wanted to preserve the tradition of Bodhidharma, Yinshun, in his book on Chan, was ready to abandon all of the legendary accounts. He even adopted Husser's sarcastic style. So he wrote, "The greater Bodhidharma's fame in China, the more texts were attributed to him. In the Taoist canon, there is the secret of the marvelous use of the inner mind of the great master Bodhidharma who lives in the world but left his form behind in one fascicle, in which Bodhidharma is said to be a sylph who lives forever. In the scripture of the tendon change of Bodhidharma, and in Bodhidharma, fists of gold, Bodhidharma has become through legend some sort of martial artist or fortune teller. This truly is the burden of fame." Now, Yinshun embraced legend and myth. He saw them as valuable as for the moral lessons they can teach us. He even wrote a book on myth, and he even proposed radical new interpretations of important Buddhist figures, Buddhist deities. So he argued in one of his books that Manjushri and Samantabhadra can be read as idealized versions of qualities of the Buddha's disciples, Shariputra and Malgayayana. Most shocking of all for a Buddhist, after tracing the earliest references to Avalokiteshvara, he suggested that we shouldn't see Avalokiteshvara as a deity or even as a historical person. The Bodhisattva, he said, should be considered a vulgarization of the Buddha's compassion. So this was not traditional. This was something new. Now, where does all of this, the death of the karmic detective, the death of traditional Buddhist historiography, where does this leave Buddhist historiography? Yinshun wasn't just an iconoclast, and he wasn't an academic historian writing for students at a university. In one of his works, he left some intriguing hints about how a modern Buddhist might approach history in a distinctive way. And this is the bit that I want to conclude on. So he has a very interesting monograph called "佛法研究佛法," Researching Buddhism with Buddhism, which he wrote in 1954. It's a collection of essays, primarily on Indian Buddhism, but what's really remarkable about the book is a short preface to it. In this preface, he applies Buddhist doctrines to historiography. How do we use Buddhist doctrines to study history? As all phenomena are essentially impermanent, he argues, it's foolish to cling to notions of hard continuity in Buddhist history. History, in all of its aspects, is a series of individual, impermanent moments. This is true for doctrine, a series of moments. It's true for institutions, a series of impermanent motions like the monastic order, and even material expressions of Buddhism. More precisely, he wrote, impermanence is arising and extinction. Arising occurs according to conditions. It is not that something arises because the consequence is present in the cause, or that it arises without consequence. We must use arising without self nature as a principle of impermanence to research and understand the occurrence of a given Buddhist sect, type of thought, practice, institution, or event. So attention to the concept of no self, in other words, reminds the historian that no event or movement arises of itself. To employ Buddhist principles towards breaking down the illusion of continuity and simplistic notions of causation makes Yinxuan argues for better history. Embracing these core Buddhist philosophical ideas allows us to be better historians. We'll become less concerned with ultimate origins or simple singular causes, and we become more sensitive to complex processes. So he writes, certainly that which has ended is in the past. History does not repeat itself. But the truth of history is that in the transformations of causes and conditions, the past always exerts an integral influence on the future. So he's not only rejecting cyclical history doesn't repeat itself, but he's insisting that we look deep into history to uncover the chain of causes that leads to a given event, idea, and figure. Buddhist notions of perception and cognition also inform his ideal historian. So he writes, according to the position of Buddhist doctrine, cognition is a faculty formed through the conditioned interaction of the knowable and the act of knowing. There is no act of cognition that is purely objective and divorced from the subjective. In other words, doing history, at least doing good history, involves constantly examining ourselves and guarding against our own personal bias. So Yinxuan was not known for meditation. He didn't meditate he was not a famous meditator. He wasn't a famous visionary. He wasn't an expert in ritual. He saw doing history as his primary form of self-cultivation. It was by doing history that we can make ourselves better. Now, Yinxuan doesn't really follow up. He has that brief, wonderful, provocative preface. He doesn't really follow it up with a sustained attempt to study Buddhist history through Buddhist doctrine, but he does suggest really interesting possibilities, the kernel of an idea that could contribute not just to Buddhist history, but to history in general. And at least in China, subsequent Buddhist historians haven't yet followed in his footsteps. They've instead chosen to contribute to Buddhist historiography entirely within the boundaries of modern academic history. But he left open the possibility for something else. He left open the possibility for Buddhist historians, and maybe even for historians more generally, to draw on Buddhist ideas when trying to understand the past and its meaning for the present. Now, I focused on China, but I'm sure that the story of Buddhist historiography in Japan is at least as rich and probably much richer. And after I finished my book, I thought my book is quite simple because I'm just looking at a few famous conventional types of histories. But there's a much more ambitious project that would examine not the way Buddhist historians wrote about the past, but instead how Buddhist philosophical and scholastic writings on causation, on the nature of time, might give us new insights into how we should approach history of all sorts. So, in conclusion, the karmic detective is dead. Long live the karmic detective. Thank you.